In this video, I will use advanced CSS selectors to further style the employee portal application. You will learn about the descendant, pseudo, and ID selectors. Here's the completed employee portal application for this video. When I mouse over any of the button controls, you can see that the overstates are yellow. When I click on a button that is in a panel container, you can see that its downstate is also yellow. However, when I click on the logout button control, which is not inside of a panel container, its downstate is not yellow. I have implemented a CSS descendant selector which explicitly targets button controls inside of panel containers. Using advanced CSS selectors, you can implement very fine control over the styles implemented in your application. To implement a descendant selector, you simply stack components in the selector definition. This example states that you want to target all of the Spark button controls that are in the Spark panel containers. You can also stack multiple levels of descendants. In this case, I am targeting the button control used in a scroller component display. However, I'm only affecting those that are in a Spark panel container. This is the starter application display for the employee portal application. You can see that by default all of the button controls have default button colors. In Flash Builder, I'm opening the associated CSS file. Remember that it is hooked up into the main application via this styles tag. At the end of the CSS file, I'm creating a descendant selector that first targets the Spark panel container and then all Spark button controls in the container. I'm setting the color property to black and the chrome color, which is the background color for the button, to yellow, pound D9E028. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that all of the button controls in the panels are yellow with black text. The logout button has not changed colors because it is not in a panel container. You'll also note that the color for the scroller components is also yellow. This happens because the scroller component is made up of button controls, and so it is also affected by this descendant selector. I'm copying the descendant selector and pasting it below itself. Now I'm adding the Spark scroller component as the second element in the selector and changing the chrome color property to gray. Pound 555555. I'm removing the color property. This code will now affect the button controls inside of a scroller component that's inside of a panel container. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the scroll bars are no longer yellow but a dark gray. A CSS pseudo-selector matches components based on an additional condition. The condition might be dynamic and might not be defined by the document tree. Pseudo-selectors are commonly used to apply styles to component states. This code shows a pseudo-selector for both the button up and the button down states. Note that you can also define universal pseudo-selectors. This code applies the same color text to all components that are in an up state. In the CSS file, I'm changing the panel container descendant selector so that it applies to the down state of the button control. I'm also adding a selector for the Spark button controls up state. This will affect the up state for all button controls, including the ones inside and outside the panel containers. I am setting up its text color to be white and its chrome color to be gray. I'm copying this selector and pasting it again to create the over state for the Spark button control. When the user mouses over the, let's say, logout button, which is outside of the panel container, the button's text color will turn black and the background will turn yellow, D9E028. When I save the file and run the application, I can test the results. All the buttons have an up state with white text and a gray background. They also turn yellow when I mouse over them. However, only the button controls in the panel stay yellow when I click on them. The logout button turns back to gray when I click on it. An ID selector styles the component that has an ID property that matches the selector defined in the CSS file. The selector is tied to one specific component instance. The syntax is to declare the ID property prefixed with a hash or pound sign. In this case, the code is targeting a button control with the ID property of submit button to turn its text to a gray color. I'm opening the Employee of the Month component and locating the label control that displays the employee name. I'm giving it an ID property with a value of employee name and removing its color property. In the CSS file, I'm creating the ID selector by typing pound employee name and setting its color property to red, pound FF0000. When I save the file and run the application, the employee's name is still red, but now it's applied using an ID selector. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Using Advanced CSS Selectors.